Welcome to Interior Design Education in the Physical Studio Space. My name is Lisa Tucker. I am a professor and department head at Virginia Tech, and I thank you for listening to my talk. In this presentation, I'm going to go over a couple of things. The first is introduce the topic of this paper. Secondly, I will put it within the context of some literature. Finally, after that, I will talk about how that applies to the context of interior design, followed by some analysis, discussion, and then conclusions. So to begin with, the history of interior design is different than the history of architecture. Within that context, however, what has happened since the beginning of the 20th century is interior design, particularly in the United States, has looked towards architecture as a model and has in many ways just adopted the model of architectural education. What I want to talk about in this particular presentation is the implications that has on not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also on a sense of belonging in the studio space and in the profession. So the history of interior design can really be talked about in several different ways. In the United States, the sort of original history of interior design was affiliated with the home decorator. In the early 20th century, with the rise of home economics programs, particularly at land-grant universities, the Home Economist Association with Interior Design became prevalent. And around the same time, or shortly thereafter, modernism and the impact, particularly of the Bauhaus, on architectural education started to infiltrate the history of interior design as well. So just to look at a very simple timeline, in the early 1920s, around that time period, we had three different things sort of happening concurrently. One was the rise of the interior decorator as exemplified by Dorothy Draper. Another is the Bauhaus, which was taking place in Dessau, Germany, and the role of women within the Bauhaus. And finally, the third one of these that was happening almost concurrently was the rise of home economics programs. So we start to see tensions between decoration, modernism, and the science of home economics. What follows shortly thereafter was the idea that a female designing within the modernist domain was focused more on things like the design of the office. Florence Knoll is an excellent example of this. So the types of design that she was doing is more closely aligned with the Bauhaus than with what was happening in either home decorating or the home economics movement. And it also takes interior design out of the realm of the home and places it more squarely in the corporate design context. The first official accreditation for interior design programs then came into being in 1970, and so many of what were formerly home economics programs became now accredited fighter programs. The Foundation for Interior Design Education and Research, which of course is now called CEDA, the Council for Interior Design Accreditation. So what this timeline underscores is the tensions that we see arising between the tradition of interior design coming out of home decoration, the history of women and design coming out of the Bauhaus, and the history of a scientific study of design processes that we see with home economists. So as interior design sought to legitimize itself, it also searched for models of education that would reinforce legitimacy. And the models, at least in the United States, that were being discovered were those that were being used in schools of architecture. So the two main streams that we see in architectural education in the U.S. Come out of the tradition of the École des Beaux-Arts and a second tradition, the Bauhaus. So this starts to have an impact on the physical environment and the pedagogy of teaching interior design. So we have three different, what I would identify as three different environments all kind of coming together. The first of these comes out of the home economics tradition, where we have the laboratory, where ideas are tested. Early in the 20th century, these might be time and motion studies, the rise of the kitchen work triangle, really looking at testing ideas and studying people in the work environment. Another concurrent environment that arises is the resource room, the sample library. And this one arguably is coming more out of the decorator tradition for interior design. And finally, the studio itself, where the work of design takes place, and what we see that being modeled after is the architecture studio. And so within this context, several people have written about the design jury, the design studio, as well as the impacts of this on feelings of inclusion, diversity, belonging, and culture. So notably was Catherine Anthony's study about design juries, and she did this early on. The first edition was in 1991, and it was a book looking at the impact that design juries actually have on different populations. And one of the things that she discovered is that females and people who were not in the majority tended to have more negative responses to the whole idea of a design jury. Other studies have looked at the role of gender and racial bias in design juries. Gary Stevens wrote a book on the sort of sociology of architecture and the culture that is created through the studio process and the design jury process, called The Favored Circle, which really talks about how that environment can disenfranchise people. Through the architectural education, a student learns how to not only do the things that an architect would do, but learns to become what an architect is. So there's this sort of enculturation that takes place in the studio environment. Looking at the roots of this are we can look to the École des Beaux-Arts as the first place, and then later on the history of the Bauhaus and modernism, and how that really all comes together to create an ideology and culture that we find in the design studio. And you'll often hear people talking about the need for a studio culture, and that's really what I'm alluding to here. So, what are some of the barriers that have been identified to feeling like you should be a designer or an architect? The first of these is cost. Supplies, books, software, all the equipment that is required, high-end computers to run graphic programs, and so on. Cost is definitely a potential barrier. Belonging, the sense of cliques being created by keeping specific cohorts together over a series of 4 or 5 years. Access, even being accepted into a program, has started to become a barrier for people for whom this may not have been something that they were adequately prepared for from an academic point of view. And then perception, particularly with interior design, there's a perception that interior design is reserved for the wealthy. It is not a required item. It's a luxury sort of service. So all of these lead to both who will apply, who does apply, and who actually enters into an interior design program. What is particularly interesting is when we look at the studio environment, these are images from the early 20th century, and you see the Bauhaus, a series of individual desks where people have their own belongings and are focused on their work, and you will also notice that everyone in the image is male. And next to that, we see the École des Beaux-Arts, a very similar kind of situation, a messy workshop type of environment where people are working at their own desks with rolls of trace and drawings, and again, in this particular photograph, completely composed of males. Fast forward 150 years, and I am showing you an architecture studio at Virginia Tech and an interior design studio at Virginia Tech, and we see essentially the same exact format that we saw 150 years ago. Individual desks with personal belongings, and if these studios were actively in use, these were taken during a break, you would see a series of drawings, rolls of trace, and the addition, in this case, of a laptop, which we wouldn't have seen 150 years ago. But the basic setup is about the same. So, what I'm arguing for here is that we really need to use what we know as interior designers to come up with a pedagogy-driven approach. And what do I mean by this? I mean, we know how to space plan for particular functions. So starting with space planning, looking to what are the learning outcomes we are trying to get students to have, and then space planning accordingly. So for instance, we know interior designers are part of a collaborative team. So individual workstations that stress individual work don't respond to that particular learning outcome. Second thing we know as interior designers is that noise, bad acoustics, poor acoustics leads to stress and can be damaging to human health. So why are we creating environments that are loud with all hard surfaces that make it difficult in some cases for people to even be able to do their work and concentrate? Third, providing furniture that supports ergonomics. As interior designers, we are the ones who are providing for the health, safety, and welfare of our students in the studio environment. So why is the furniture not then designed to support ergonomics? So what is a strategy that we could use? Assess designers and what best, as designers, assess what best supports student learning and the the health and well-being of our students. Assess then, once we have come up with a new environment, try solutions using an evidence-based design approach and determine the effectiveness of these solutions. So some recommendations that I would make for this particular approach: try a new spatial configuration, create spaces for collaboration and teamwork, create spaces for private work. What is the identity of interior design that makes it unique, separate, and different from architecture, and really create design solutions that reflect that. Review models, new pedagogical models such as project-based learning, peer-to-peer evaluation. Set our environments up to reflect the importance of being part of a team as opposed to an individual. And finally, cultivate leadership within teams, cultivating both leaderships and how to be active participants in a team environment, and really differentiate the role of interior design and what the model of interior design education is, separate from the model we have adopted from architecture. So in summary, interior design looked for historical models. I think the sample room of the decorator tradition, the laboratory of the home economics tradition, and the studio environment that has been widely adopted from architecture all have something to contribute. And interior design as a discipline would really benefit from studying what it is that we are actually trying to teach, and then creating environments which we know how to do that respond to the learning outcomes and intention of our educational programs. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.